Hello, everyone. So this panel is proposed by three of us, which is titled Thinking Aesthetics, Law and Informality in the Ordering of the Urban Margins. Just to give a little background, three of us have a long association. We have been working together, and in different ways, questions of margins through an ethnographic exploration has been part of our work. We have worked together in projects and floated reading groups also, which are still going on. Me and Ruchira, we come from the same institute, which is a teacher education college of Delhi University. As part of this college, we have been associated with state-run schools. Chetan was part of our college, and after that, there are three projects with which we have been associated. First was on violence in the school, in which we looked at the questions of violence, which took us from violence to powerlessness, which Chetan will talk about while making some other connections also. From this project, we moved to another one, which was on the school and out-of-school relation. The third one, which was in fact anchored at IHS only, we looked at the questions of margins, education, margin, and city. These are some of, we work together, and here is a work which we are presenting, which is drawing from a doctoral work as well as the research projects. So I'll start with my presentation, my paper, which is on thinking exception in aesthetic governmentality. I draw from these projects as well as my doctoral work, which is like more than a decade old now. Yeah, so in this work, through the ethnographic study of urban margins, where I specifically refer to Basti or slums and the state-run schools from where children of the Basti go, this paper unpacks the educational processes and practices which are at play. And by that I mean both in the school as well as in the Basti, to examine the questions of statecraft that is primarily interested in the ordering of the margins. Now, whenever we talk of margins, it opens the debates of formal, informal, and legal, illegal. We are already aware of the vacuousness of these binaries. Moreover, we are also aware of the role that informalities play in shaping our cities, which cannot function just in the formal legal connect. However, literature has demonstrated how these binaries are activated to suit the ordering and governing of its population, and they come in handy for the state. Margins become the site where this tension becomes visible. As the seemingly formal legal world of the city, it ascribes certain illegalities to the informal lives that are lived by the marginal population. And this is done by activating the statecraft. Education is one of the important processes that play an important role that allows this translation of informal into illegal. And this is a work in progress in which I'm trying to understand some of this. We know from the work of Gautam Bhan how space emerges as an important marker to examine the continuity between informal and illegal, as is shown in the case of evictions, giving rise to spatial illegality. Education emerges as a space that further adds on to the sensibilities that work towards creating a discourse of illegalities that is associated with the margins, allowing for the translation from informalities to the illegalities. How does this translation occur? How are the discourses and the sensibilities are generated is a question that I'm interested in exploring further. I'll be taking few examples from the state-run schools, and then I'll go to COVID. After that, I'll talk about how aesthetics as a category is employed, followed by little bit on exclusion. If I get time, I'll also talk about how this informal illegal continuum is also internalized by the people who are living at the Basti. Now, children of the Basti go to the neighboring state-run schools or low-fee private schools. Negative attitude towards the Basti, that is the place image with which children have been identified. These adults, which are the teachers, NGO workers, principal, largely from the formal world of the city, call them Basti ke bache, children from Basti. Pronouns like these are often, yahan ke, ye, are often pejoratively used to address them. The differences of caste, class, and religion are obfuscated as they are seen en masse. Homogenized with a single identity, children from the slum are seen as one. This dissolution of the differences amongst the children is not neutral, as space emerges as an important category that calls for examination. The physical markers of the space are attributed to the bodies of the children. Like the spaces from where they come, they are seen as carriers of filth, mess, and chaos, which are associated with the Basti. Dissociation from it becomes difficult, and there is a fusion that one can see, giving space to the marker of spatial identity. Space emerges as a seemingly neutral marker, becoming a starting point for the other forms of exclusion. For example, caste and class translates into spatial markers in the language of teachers when association with pigs is made. They live with pigs, or the whole family lives in one room, or they get free things, everything from the government, but these children still don't want to study. There's a certain kind of pejorative attitude which also has a paternalism over here. These remarks, more than that, hide the teacher's caste and class bias behind language that signifies the spatial identity of the child. Somewhere in the name of the space, there is much more which is happening. The representation of a slum and its location in the city has legitimacy in the discourse of teachers, and often spatial markers replace caste and class markers as a result. The city functions on this discourse of spatiality, which also intersects legal-illegal continuum and is used to maintain a precarious urban order. Coming to Bhaviskar, who mentions bourgeois gaze that pushes the working class to the peripheries of the city by using the aesthetic markers of order, hygiene, and beauty, one can see the same sensibilities working in the school also, where it is this middle class gaze which is activated when teachers speak with children and they find the lives of children crowded, dirty, and unhygienic. At school, they are reminded of their failing backgrounds. This identification based on place image translates into spatial illegality, where the spaces children come, that is basti, are considered unwanted, and they are even blamed for marring the beautiful, formal, clean, and orderly world of the school, and by extension of the city. The spaces of the city these children come from are considered illegal in the larger sensibilities of the dominant middle class. These sensibilities are anchored on appearance. What we witness is a certain technical rationality that is sustained by how things appear. And there is an aesthetics that governs the rationality with which schools discipline their children, and as an extension, the margins. During COVID, the aesthetic markers of hygiene of the middle class got another force. It became another such event which reminded them of their subservient status in the functioning of the city. How exception has become the mode of governance today comes to the forefront, and not just as exceptional measure. The sentiment of betrayal hits the people of Basti as much as the economic loss that comes with COVID. Like many other women in the Basti, Manju works as a house help in the nearby bungalows. She mentions the ill treatment that she experienced from the same family that she has served for years. With sadness, she points out how they were not allowed entries in the same home, and people would talk to them by covering their faces. By stretching her hand straight, she demonstrates how she was being told to stand distant, and the instructions were rallied at her. Speak from distance, cover your mouth, stay away. She tells me further, we also have children. We are also worried about our health and your health. We are not just worried about our health, but are worried about your health and your children's health also. She mentions how she has taken care of children in this home for years and was instrumental in bringing them up, and how a treatment of this kind was completely unnecessary. She says, "Are we mad? Do we look insane? We do know how to take care of ourselves and also of you. We know what is good and what is bad." What we see here is the biological character of COVID shifted with its social ramifications. It carries color, caste, creed with it. When human beings navigated this virus, such has been the case with the earlier pandemic also, and one can be reminded of Foucault's work, who has demonstrated the role of pandemics in structuring of the city. Manju's body becomes the manifestation of virus, and her sheer existence is seen as a threat to the homes that she has served. The gaze of the virus that is exercised differentially in human societies is what we have been able to capture in our interactions with people at the margins. This also brings forth the transversal nature of virus, which Alan Bourdieu talks about when he articulates while talking about the social determinants that come forth in this natural phenomena. The complex thing about an epidemic, as he says, is that it is always a point of articulation between natural determinants and social determinants. Its complete analysis is transversal. One must grasp the points where the two determinants cross each other, and from that draw the consequences. Margins emerge as that arena where this transversal aspect becomes visible. How during COVID, the informal lives of margins acquire an illegality by anchoring on the aesthetic sensibilities is a question which interests us. In this informal illegal continuum, law's relationship with exception becomes necessary. There is always certain tension which we can see here between the force of law and the content of law. In the case of margins and for the ordering function, it is the force of law that one can see getting activated even without a content of law, as I have tried to demonstrate with some of the cases. These are, after all, the cases where norms are present and not the explicit laws, and yet they seem to acquire the force of the law. How is that happening? Norms acquire a legal form, and hence legal form is attributed to something that cannot have a legal form, which is an important problem to understand the way state functions in the contemporary times. The rational arguments woven around ambiguous categories of order, beauty, and hygiene have taken a force today that finds continuities, and it establishes fresh linkages with the traditional social exclusionary measures of caste, class, and religion. These earlier categories of exclusion are repacked fresh by deploying sensibilities which do not have any locus standi, legally and constitutionally, yet are able to exert strong normalizing force. The aporia so emerges is where force of law not only works independently of the content of law, but can even be in opposition to it. Law and rights, instead of being emancipatory and speaking for the cause of the marginalized, become the platform that ensures the ordering of urban margins by providing a solid footing to the sensibilities which otherwise look slippery. These are some of the subtle shifts within the spectrum of exclusion that further adds to the difficulty in grasping the social markers of divisibility. Before I come to exclusion, I want to make a little remark. Interestingly, we can see how state, by using the laws directly, is demonstrating a movement towards controlling and ordering the population and is short-circuiting the rights that are actually the other side of it. This can be seen in the case of evictions, as Bhan shows, or the bourgeois environmentalism of Baviskar and other urban scholars also, where progressive measures of laws and rights are used to ensure the ordering of society. Law is being deployed today to ensure control and regulation, and not to question the biopolitical side of the state. Coming to 2 minutes. Okay. Yeah. So this brings open the coming to exclusion. How this informs the discussions on exclusion. This brings open the quadruple structure of inclusion-exclusion, which is not only about what is included and what is excluded. So these are not the binaries. Agamben gives a new way to understand the binary of inclusion and exclusion, as the need dichotomy doesn't really help us understand the experiences. Their language doesn't count for what they experience, as we are forced to choose either from inclusion or exclusion. He argues that inclusion and exclusion is not a binary, but we have two more sides attached to it, giving it a quadruple structure. Taking from a mathematical set, he points out alongside simple inside and outside of a set, something can be excluded while being included into a set, and something can be included while being excluded. Bourdieu, in translating this into political terms, has membership corresponding to presentation and inclusion corresponding to representation. So then we are talking about not just exclusion, inclusion, but membership and inclusion. One can be included, one can be member, but not really being included, and the other way around. And Bourdieu talks about it by giving it a language of membership corresponding to presentation and inclusion, which becomes representation. To represent adds a layer above a mere presence, elevating one's relationship in a democracy beyond any instrumental relationship between citizen and the state. This is acknowledged to be important for any republic where the ideal condition of citizenship cannot just be mere presence, as a citizen should be able to represent the state. The debates around corrosion of citizenship can be seen in this slide, where a citizen is made to be present but not really represent. Coming to education, democratic functioning of a classroom depends on such acts of representation and not mere presence. Instrumentalization of the relationship between citizenship and the state not only slowly corrodes the rights of citizens, but can also sanction the worst kinds of violence in the long run. The instrumental relationship can be seen when teachers say, these children only come to eat food in the school, in the context of midday meal. Teachers use the threat to whole class that you will not get food today if you do not behave. Two things which emerge from the above discussion. First, for a citizen to represent an essential condition in the formation of a republic, mere membership is not enough. Second, the binary of inclusion and exclusion is not sufficient to understand how citizen can belong to the larger political sphere. Yeah, thank you.
I'm Ruchira Das, and my paper titles Aestheticized City Life and the Tribal Margins in a Metropolis, Negotiating the Inclusion-Exclusion Axis. Before I start my presentation, I just want to mention that I'm really happy to be back in IHS because I was associated with the TSF project for a year and I really love this space. So thank you IHS for giving me this opportunity. So what I'm going to speak would more sound like a conceptual framework, even though I will try to bring insights from the field to understand the urban margins in today's times where aesthetic governmentality seems to dominate urban planning. With the advent of modernity and the rise of modern power, the mode of governance was rooted in scientific rationality, which was systematic and clear about how things ought to be. Systems were designed to categorize population that needed to be controlled and managed. Hence, the core margin dichotomy was overtly affirmed in the procedures of urban ordering, unlike the aesthetic mode of governance, where there is a conspicuous absence of techniques and procedures. I would like to mention in the very beginning that aesthetics is not just a consequence of neoliberalism. Aesthetics has always been integral to politics. There's a history of urban cleansing and beautification drive since the time of colonialism. Moreover, taste, beauty, civility are subjective categories that bear caste and class connotations in India. What is interesting is the dominance of this aesthetic governmentality defining the structure of the city in the current times. So the paper is situated in the context of a time that is witnessing massive urban restructuring and transformation. This changing landscape of the city spaces is anchored by a vision that emerges from the conception of what Asher Gertner calls the idea of world-class city making, grounded in aesthetic governmentality. This vision is an imagination of a landscape that organizes the city into markers of development. Aestheticized city life is shaped by a code of appearance and desirability that banishes or invisibilizes the ugly, polluting spaces, that is, the margins of the city, who are meant to blemish the visualized, sanctified landscape. In the words of Amitabh Bhaviskar, the bourgeoisie gaze identifies the margins as disfiguring the landscape, creating a paradigm of the encroacher. Therefore, the aim of aesthetic ordering is tidying up and beautifying the city by delegitimizing the filthy, chaotic, contaminating encroachers and their claims to space and belongingness within the city. According to Gertner, I quote, "Who and what belongs to the city is determined by codes of appearance or visual. In the rule of aesthetics, social order is maintained through public mode of viewership, reasoned injunctions, systems of belief, and statutory command, which is random and arbitrary in nature." What is significant to understand and deliberate how city is governing in ways that is easily legitimizing such binaries, creating diverse forms of exclusion and operationalizing techniques of disposability, making those at the peripheries of the city illegible that as per bourgeoisie sensibilities are meant to create obstruction in the imagination of the world-class dream and hence to be disposed of. Access to the city therefore becomes an exercise in denial which targets those at the margins through their careful abandonment. However, what is fascinating about this aesthetically grounded form of knowledge or power, this world-class aesthetics, as Gertner quotes, is that it inspires among its potential subjects a will to participate in its discourse and to make the visual criteria their own. This gets articulated through a shared imagination, which Jack Rancière calls as distribution of the sensible or community sense. There's a shared mode of aesthetic engagement between the ones who are governed and the ones who govern, with mutually recognizable visual markers of order and disorder. Those who are governed, that is the margins, are drawn towards this state-injected vision, this aesthetically grounded imagination that becomes their own, and they appropriate the same ways to govern themselves. What is interesting is to examine how this virtual imagination of the state becomes the collective vision of the margins, which is power from below from the Foucauldian lens. In fact, this resonates with Bernard Stiegler's idea of proletarization. Proletarization is the state of human condition that experience loss in the capacity to produce knowledge. Reduced to taking orders and doing as been told, a proletariat is one who cannot create and think. In this thoughtlessness, the vision of those who govern themselves, those who govern becomes the vision of those who are governed. And this is how rule of aesthetics is increasingly gaining its legitimacy in the urban spaces. Keeping this conceptual frame in mind, the paper is trying to understand and capture the life worlds, the lived realities, and the experiences of an urban tribal margin from the lens of aesthetics. This ethnographic study, specifically on the Santhal tribe, who have migrated from different parts of West Bengal and its neighboring states and are living as permanent residents in the city of Kolkata for more than 4 decades now. In studies on marginalities and marginal groups, state was never part of the sociological or anthropological lens for a long time. How are margins spatially and socially seen, ordered, manipulated, and governed by the state is something that most of the ethnographic works on marginality have missed out. It's a groundbreaking work by Veena Das and Deborah Poole titled Anthropology in the Margins of the State that provided a conceptual framework to look at state practices in the everyday lives of the people. Now, the vision of Poriborton, meaning transformation, an ambitious project launched by the state government of West Bengal that aimed at turning Kolkata into London of the East, is rooted in, I would say, hyper-aesthetic sensibilities. So the question that emerges is that how is this aesthetic restructuring of the city giving rise to a terrain for politics of the margins over which the migrant Santals are trying to claim their belongingness to the city? There is aestheticization of the city, and this is revealed in the clean, sanitized, and neatly paved Hooghly River Ghats with trident lights along the paths. The imagination is to make the Ganga Ghats appear as banks of the Thames River. There is also this 135-foot replica of the London Big Ben on the road of the Kolkata airport, the replica of the Wall Street Bulls and the Fearless Girl. Then there are theme parks for beautifying the city with the construction of Western monuments and architectural structures like the replica of the Pyramids of Egypt, the Great Wall of China, Eiffel Tower, etc. Besides the high-rise gated constructions and the global malls catering to world-class consumerist taste. Simultaneously, this project, Poriborton, is also ensuring that Bangaliana or Bengaliness that is rooted in the Bhadralok cultural traditions, and it is ensuring that that tradition is retained or rather reimagined by the state to uphold the nostalgia of Bengal's cultural past. Government has therefore issued orders to have loudspeakers playing Rabindra Sangeet or Rabindranath Tagore's Bengali songs at major traffic intersections. Also evoking the Bengali Bhadralok pride, state is taking initiatives to recreate the aesthetics of feudal Bengal by restoring the traditional houses of the Bengali aristocrats into heritage homestays. So the question is, in this strategically planned beautification of Kolkata and in this seemingly paradoxical approaches of having a futuristic fantasy of the city space and simultaneously romanticizing the traditional Bhadralok past, how do we understand the transforming city's relationship with this particular urban tribe who are permanent residents of the city for the past 40 years and are yet at the margins of the metropolitan desire, located at the peripheries of the city in socially, spatially segregated ghettos or enclaves, however we may call them. The multiple Santhal ghettos formed in the urban settlement of Satragachi, which is a fringe settlement, I would say, and it's about 7 kilometers away from the mainland city, are not spaces created as temporary stopgaps. In fact, the emergence of the ghettos is a response of the brutality and exclusion the tribe experienced in the city. The Santhal colony that is created in Satragachi became a mark of a counter-hegemonic struggle. Ghettos became a space where Santhals relived and asserted their primordial past in the city. Hence, practicing Sari Dharam, which is their religion, constructing the holy grove where Santhal deities are believed to reside, formation of the Santhal Council, practicing Santhali customs and rituals, celebrating the Santhali traditional festivals, organizing cultural programs, formation of tribal networks through various Santhali clubs and associations, creating an Adivasi housing cooperative, emphasis on speaking Santhali, developing textual literature in Santhali language, and an assertion for Santhali language and script in formal education became ways to negotiate the city. In the Santhal colony, it was interesting to find families where 3 generations were living together. In fact, all the 40 families that are part of my study had 3 generations living together. In the everydayness of their lives and practices in the city, the Santhal collective, specifically those from the first generation, ensured that Santhaliness is retained in their ghettos. According to Giorgio Agamben, such spaces can be understood as camp-like structures that emerged because city revealed a state of exception as a technique of governmentality. According to Agamben, exception is nothing but inclusive exclusion. It is a space where law is suspended, blurring the boundaries between rule and exception, licit and illicit. This happens because sovereign power needs to blur the lines in order to legitimize its ever-growing control over the lives of its citizens, and this becomes all the more visible at the margins. Sovereign has complete authority over the lives in these spaces, not only as citizens of the state, but even to the point of acting upon their natural life, depriving them the right to live. Camps are spaces where not only political rights are denied, but also the conditions of human life itself. Agamben's camp therefore becomes a paradigm to understand why the Santhal ghettos are disposable spaces, a zone of unruliness, ungovernmentality, where margins are kept away from the realm of law and politics. Rule of aesthetics emerge where lives are castrated from law and politics. Hence, lives of the Santhals are invisibilized. They become illegal and illegible in the aesthetic imagination of the city. This tribal margin, divorced from law and politics, to negotiate their fragmented self, aspires to participate in the aesthetic transformation of the city. However, aspirations of these fragmented lives is anchored on desires that are disengaged from the reality. Visual attributes of the space governed through aesthetics operates on a regime that partitions virtual from the real. The Santhal margins therefore hallucinates of a future that stands on sheer fantasy that have lost its connection with the native reality. This is a psychotic state in psychoanalysis which is exploited by the state. However, for the tribe, this imagination is not a mark of their resignation, but an effort made to be recognized as legitimate subjects of the globalizing discourse that dominates the structuring of the city. The premise of this imagination is a false certainty, and yet they are lured in the vision because it helps them to negotiate and cope feelings of unbelongingness, marginality, and brutality of the city. In fact, this kind of an imagination creates an illusion of hope in the banishment of the margins. Thus, the second generation Santhals aspired for a globally oriented middle-class life to belong to the city. The urban class status they attained living in the city for more than 40 years facilitated their contact with the market-oriented spaces, the consumerist culture with a developing taste for global products, visiting malls for weekend enjoyment, dine out at the global food joints, prefer international brands over local tailors to wear the latest fashions, employ full-time servants in their households, send their children to private English language schools, and aspires English language schools and aspire for corporate jobs. All this provided a public space of a kind where the tribal margins felt included, belonged, accepted, with an imagination that this cosmopolitan orientation catered to the sanctioned aesthetic markers that would make them eligible to be part of the world-class imagination of the city. Also, second generation's acting Bhadralok. This is an idea which is taken from John Obu's framework of acting white in the context of African Americans, that is emulating the polished and the civilized. That is the Bhadraloks. This is important as the Bhadralok Bangaliana or Bengaliness sensibilities dominate Kolkata. Hence, Santhals are found developing refined behavior, developing a taste for Bengali literature, music, celebrating Bengali traditions, and other cultural dispositions to be acceptable in the city. Now, this acting Bhadralok is grounded in aesthetics. Acting Bhadralok means transcending the stigma of being a Chotolok, the uncivilized, the unpolished, and is therefore imagined to be a visual marker adhering to the sanctified norms of appearance and civility that would legitimize the tribe's position in the city, driven by aesthetic modalities. Now, what is interesting is that this aesthetic dimension has also seeped into formal education. World-class aesthetics perceive education from the lens of efficiency, performance, and excellence. The aesthetic markers that define quality and influence the aspiration for education and the choice of schools. Whose knowledge is privileged and what forms of knowledge are legitimized through the practices of the state is grounded in aesthetics. This is revealed in the anxieties and dilemmas the second generation Santhal migrants go through in their choice of school for their children. The migrants aspire for an education that can provide marketable knowledge, help in persona building, develop English language proficiency, and groom their children in ways so that they are able to cope the neoliberal world. Second generation Santhals do not prioritize their lives within the narrow confines of their native traditions. For them, education can be an aesthetic medium or a visual marker through which they can claim their position in the world-class spaces of the city. Another example would be the migrants' quest for education, to use it as a medium that can cater to the need for developing textual literature to raise a counter-hegemonic struggle against the Bengali Bhadralok community. Santhali literature as a form of cultural representation becomes an aesthetic marker again to claim their belongingness to the city, something that oral traditions, according to the migrants, have failed to. The aesthetic dimension in education further gets reflected in the contradictory discourses among the migrant Santhals on the usage of mother tongue and their native script as a medium of instruction in formal learning. Aspiring to be legitimate members of the city, a section of the community desires to adhere to the approved aesthetics and therefore resist the discourse of acquiring education in the native language and script. This faction of Santhals believes that while there is a regard for Santhali script being developed, they cannot turn a blind eye to the fact that learning to read and write Santhali using Old Chiki, their indigenous script, has no market value considering the demands of the global neoliberal age. However, what is significant to understand is that whether mother tongue and native script is used as a medium to assert their ethno-lingual identity or resisting the introduction of mother tongue and native script as a medium of instruction in schools, both has an aesthetic underpinning, as both can be seen as ways to negotiate their social recognition and to gain their legitimacy in the city. Thus, aestheticization of education, what is important to understand is that the crisis education is going through in today's time as it loses its legitimacy in the biopolitical space, blocking imaginations in ways that there is a disengagement with reality. This short-circuiting in education that creates a void plays a significant role in the emergence of aesthetic consensus, something that is evident in my study on the Santhal margins of Kolkata. I'll stop here. Thank you.
I'm audible now? Yeah, I'll just quickly start and finish fast, I think. Yeah, so my topic of my paper is Thinking Aesthetic Governmentality Through Image Symbolic Opposition. As far as ethnography, it's a form of knowledge that privileges one's experience as a mode of knowing. That is, it is a form of knowing and doing that tries to hold its object of study without reducing it to a thing, without objectifying it. What I'm presenting here is a snippet of the world I experienced working in a basti with young children in South Delhi, basically, elite part of Delhi. This paper is also a struggle between locating certain sociological forms of thinking and frameworks with certain psychoanalytic forms of thinking. And I'm not using psychoanalysis simply by confusing or conflating the individual for the social, simply that translation, but I also don't want to completely let go of the insights or the forms of thinking that come with locating the individual at the center of the social organization. So let's see, and that critique is out there in the open. So the world I'm here talking about is both near and far from the sensibilities of middle-class world. It is near in the sense that it looms large presence, not only materially, as the drivers, households, etc., but also in our sensibilities. One of the lines that I see active in schools that I did my fieldwork in was that this is a school, not a slum, or this is not your basti, or this is not your home. It's a world that we try and keep out through our gates, formal documentations, and even the self-referential nature of our laws, institutional rules, and sensibilities of knowledge and education. Now, there's a young boy, Shiva, who I met a few days back before coming here, actually. I know him from past 2 years. He used to study maths with me when he was in 7th standard. He was an excited young child who loved solving maths. I would give him questions outside of his schoolwork, and he would sit around me doing them, and also checking the work of other students. I used to think that I would get some good maths book photocopied for him and ask him to read it. Then one day he went to his village, and when he came back, he was really ill. He wasn't the same boy after his bout of illness, which lasted a few months in his case. Then I learned he wanted to be a footballer and started playing football in his evenings, telling me that nowadays he isn't as interested in studying. He wants to work and earn money, be a footballer or a YouTuber. And that's also become a thing in our times. A few days back when I met him, he had grown weak, he had left his football. He was telling me that he may fail his 9th standard and does not know what to do. He mentioned how finishing his 12th seems very far to him now, and he may want to enter the job market sooner if he finds something. My intention isn't to evoke a sense of pity. I'm sure he will find his way, and he generally isn't a sad child except after his illness. We don't realize how life-altering illnesses can be in that milieu, and how long the effects of simple infection can last. From the side of schooling, teachers are overburdened with documentation work, which they constantly complain about. I should rather say that the nature of the professional identity itself has shifted from teaching and learning to a certain managerial role that has taken the burden of the contradictions of the system. It's a common narrative that teachers hit the students in the school, and almost every other child sort of tells us that. What is most startling is not hitting. Violence, in strange way, finds its hold and legitimacy at the margins. For instance, it's common for children to tell us that there was a fight happened in the basti last night. Sometimes the fight would be between family members of 2 kids standing right there. They will defend their family members, but also laugh at the fight. There's a lot that can be said here about how neighborhood intimacy functions in these spaces. There is aggression and there is violence, but there is a certain forms of intimacy and relationships holding within that space. There's an indifference that fills a certain lack of symbolic universe, symbolic that should stitch the child's life in the basti to the formal institutions of the state. School fills this gap immediately. It does fill it. But it fills it with hygiene drives, yoga days, toilet days, drawing competitions about the state and so on and so forth. State constantly tries to make and unmake itself on the bodies of the child. It's an effort to establish an ideal image of itself, a form of identification that Lacan calls imaginary identification. And the object of this type of identification reflects a narcissistic ego's own image of itself, he calls specular image. This inevitably creates situations that are tragic and comical at the same time. For instance, I'm just skipping up now due to lack of time, but on a yoga day, you have a speaker and the TV built, and the Prime Minister's speech is coming from the TV. And what you see is that the speech is lagging behind the audio, visual in that sense. And the reason for that is the speech is being played on the phone. You go and you ask, why is that happening? So they forgot that they had the TV, they knew that, they forgot that they need the audio speakers alongside that. And once an intern tried to figure it out, why isn't it working? You realized immediately that the wire is missing. And teachers then tell the other teacher in front of me that anyway, we have just take the photograph. What is important is to click the photograph that every child is listening. It's not important whether they hear the speech or not. Same thing happened, when on a hygiene day, they have to clean the hands. So a child has cleaned the hand 4 or 5 times because picture is not coming right. So it creates extremely comical and tragic, in that sense. So in this case, what you see is it's not simply that the students are being examined in the school. Teachers are constantly under the gaze of examination in that sense. They are, as Hannah Arendt would say, they are representing a bureaucratic rule, which is a rule by nobody in that sense. You don't know whom to ask the question that whether this is logical or not, or whether this is rational or not, what we are doing. And I've elsewhere argued that it's not the power of the teachers that lend itself to violence, but it's actually their powerlessness in the system. The more, and Krishna Kumar sort of called it the meek dictator. That more powerless you become, the more resort to violence, you actually have. Gertner's conception of world-class city plays a dominant role in the imagination of teachers and students. And world-class city here functions as a paradigm of a whole spectrum of phrases. India becoming Singapore, Paris, Beijing, leading global knowledge center, so on and so forth. Education is increasingly becoming a space where the imagination is constantly acted out with more force than ever, just like we act out the symptoms in psychoanalysis. Gertner calls world-class city a diffuse signifier that trains a particular way of seeing and putting in place of aesthetically grounded form of power or knowledge, that inspires amongst its potential subjects a will to participate in its discourse and to make its visual criteria their own. As I understand, and I just finish it here. As I understand, diffuse signifier enables the form of signification where the signifier can constantly slip over the signified. That is, it can constantly create meanings for itself in different discourses that are untethered and unanchored from its own origin. The absence of a crucial signifier or signification process excludes a specific subject-other experience. When this subject-other relationship becomes barred, the other only emerges as a threat, a point of disintegration of the self, or a point of narcissistic satisfaction. That is what you see this distancing between teacher and students to hold. And that distancing, as I'm arguing, is not only a function of violence. In fact, violence is a symptom of the problem in some senses. What is actually emerging is a certain lack of a symbolic universe which can hold these two things simultaneously together. In my experience of working in the Basti, I'm realizing that what we're witnessing at the margins is a way of inhabiting a world without the symbolic coordinates. By this I mean that there's an intense desire and aspiration of the people to participate in the formal middle-class world, in the Basti. But the symbolic coordinates to articulate these desires and aspirations are missing. Filling these vacuums are these excessive images, an effort to sustain the political realm with minimum of richness that language generally can provide for us. The symbolic grammar necessary to hold difference, to work through and sustain intense desires and aspirations, constantly slips and morphs. It is this slipping and stumbling of the symbolic world that is characteristic in Lacan's description of psychotic structure, which is different from medical diagnostic categories of neurosis and psychosis. And politics in general has been thought to be opposed to violence, and because of its relationship to language. And Arendt has consistently argued that that wherever violence sort of reigns, language gets destroyed in that sense. Question that emerges for me are that within this context, is there a way to retrieve the old symbolic coordinates back for us? Questions like, just 10 seconds, 5 seconds. Questions like, maybe modernity, maybe capitalism, maybe from the communism, or are we standing at a point where some new symbolic universe has to emerge? And if it has to emerge, what is the ground? What are the anchoring points from which that work can start? And it's an open question. Thank you so much. Any questions, discussions? I hope
Thank you. So about those who are at the urban margins, education, like what has come out much from my field work, like most of them see education as a only means for mobility. But within them, there are some people who have to grapple with such aspirations, but economic compulsions, which may not allow their children to take up education, whether in government establishments or private. So in this grappling of aspirations and economic compulsion, how state-driven education system has played role with, there are certain private budget schools also emerging. So there would be people talking about, no, I don't want my children to go to government school. They'll end up doing the same kind of jobs I am doing. So how those legal systems and this multi-stakeholders operate?
Yeah, okay.
It's, to the panel, not
to
anybody.
Are you taking a bunch together? Can I go?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Okay, sure. So first of all, thank you all three of you. That's a very, very stimulating set of panels, very, very thoughtful, very provocative. So I actually have a bunch of questions. I'm just going to leave. You can answer some and we can chat later. But the first one I wanted to just think about, so I find your invocation of aesthetics very compelling, right? To understand power in a certain way. And this is something I've been struggling with myself as well, is to think that in the contemporary, if you take Delhi, all three of your papers are said somewhere, it almost feels like a contemporary regime of power doesn't even require aestheticization. And so sometimes I wonder a little bit, if we thought of the evictions in the 2000s and the evictions you say in front of G20, G20 did not even bother with the symbolic subterfuge. Right? There's a kind of bruteness to a kind of power that we're seeing. So I wonder if aestheticization sometimes for a lot of us was a way to understand how come an eviction can happen in a representative democracy. Right? Because we were surprised by them. What if we're no longer surprised by them? So then the question is, what is the role of the aesthetic? Is it to justify it? Is it to rebrand it? Because it certainly doesn't seem to need it as a moral legitimacy. A certain aestheticization was to give a moral legitimacy to state action. What if the state doesn't require that moral legitimacy? So what does aestheticization do in a certain brute force kind of moment where the intention is stated and the action is clear? Right? So that's one thought I was having, just the limit of whether the concept and the time is falling. And the second question, Ruchira, was particularly for you, because I was really struck by this idea of when Jyoti was talking about the sets, right, of differentiated inclusion and inclusive. And I was thinking would your argument also, how would your argument work in Ranchi, which is a city that is 1/3 Santali, right? Where the symbolic language of Santhal life cannot in any way be argued vis-a-vis the containment or a kind of ghetto, right? In fact, it's again the opposite argument, where every chalk has Birsa Munda. You have the flags, you have the grove, you have the celebration, but in terms of the same city imagination, right? Where in fact all those tribal forms have become an invocation to actually co-opt, rather than to give space. So I was really struck by how you were saying that these spaces were both spaces of assertion, but not. And I was just thinking, what would it mean to read it through a city where the tribe is not a minority category, but a foundational category, both for Jharkhand in its nationalist imagination and for Ranchi as a contemporary tribal urban city, right? Just as a thought experiment, because I was struck by the presence of a Santhali public visual culture in Ranchi, but also its domestication, and thinking a little bit about what happens then when that same symbolism circulates freely, but then doesn't have any emancipatory power, because those symbols don't then have that power. And just one thing which I'm just thinking through, but the invocation of the camp, I think both works, but is also a little troubling for me. And only because Agamben's invocation of the camp was around the Holocaust. And its question was not a question of exclusion, but a question of bare life. And actually, in a way, if some of our excluded margins openly became camps, they would almost be easier to understand. Because the problem here is that at the margin, you are neither allowed to exit that aspirational. You're not allowed to be a camp. You have to still continue to believe. So in a way, you're kept included, but never allowed to exit the system that excludes you. Right? There's an insistence. It's like the patriarchal family. Right? You cannot exit it. Right? Even if it is the source of your violation. And so I'm just thinking about whether the camp how we bring the camp out of that context into this inequality, because it does come from a different place. And the last question for all three of you is this idea of, are these arguments, and I find them very convincing, are these arguments only from the margins? Because honestly, when you're describing this idea of the psychotic state, and this symbolic overload. We are in January heading to a massive event in a few days, and I feel completely identified with the psychotic state, right? In a way. So I'm also thinking about, does the center not hold the same kind of psychosis as the margin, right? So does one need the basti to make this argument, or is the basti one side to make it? But actually, the holding of power and structure is absolutely the same side for psychosis, right? And it's something that you can study other agendas and study institutions of power as much as you can, right? Because I don't want us to think then of this argument as an argument about margins, as opposed to an argument from margins. So just a thought, what would it look like to use these arguments about the center? And about the sort of narrative we are being now sold as a narrative of who we are, right, or who we could become. But again, thank you very much. It's very thoughtful.
Thanks, Gautam. Yeah.
So, congratulations on your wonderful papers. I recently read Palat Narayanan's work on world class as a provincial construct, where he says that to understand, we shouldn't use world class we shouldn't use world class as an aesthetic derivative, or I don't know if I'm putting it the right way, to understand the exclusionary process of urbanization. Rather, he says that world class is a local construct. It has a historicity to it when it comes to the planning discourse in India. It's not just an imagery of the North. So, and we cannot use it to understand the exclusionary urbanization and development process in cities. So in a way, it sort of counters what Gertner talks about rule by aesthetics, understanding world class as a concept. And so I just want to understand, like in between these two seminal works, how would you then place aesthetics? Have you thought about Palat Narayanan's work? And sort of also, because there is sort of an inherent Eurocentrism also in our works, when we try to sort of look at, these global processes. And there is a huge need to provincialize and sort of bring whatever is happening around us, sort of locate them locally. Like to understand, not to forget the history. And not to dwell in just the contemporary. Gertner was talking about when he went to the field, what kind of narratives he got from the people. Like how people who were dislocated and dispossessed by this rule by aesthetics believed in it and were part of, like what Ruchira you were saying, how people shared this, this world class is a shared vision. So that was Gertner's work. But if you look at Narayanan's work and he's looking at the historical documents and the planning process, the master plan, he says that Delhi and Colombo have their own trajectories of being world-class and their own logic to it. So it's a logical next step for them. So it makes sense not to just look at world-class as an aesthetic concept. So if you can talk about it, have you thought about it, or would you like to reflect now?
Thank you. I really enjoyed this entire panel, and I would actually love to sit with your texts and sort of with them for some time. Also, what I really liked is thinking about education alongside planning and just thinking about aesthetics in that. And I'm not sure how to ask this. Maybe it's more of a comment, or if you have thoughts. But how do we think about aesthetics and thinking about order? And if I think about planning and education, these have been sites of exclusion, of power, but they've also the promise of them is mobility. The promise of these is an imagination. So I guess also thinking about where we go from here, what is that connect between or disconnect between the aesthetics and imaginations and futures. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ruchira. Do I start? And then maybe, Ruchira, you can pick it up. Huh? I think, thanks. I think I'll start with Gautam's last thing that he was saying and what you were just raising over here. Yeah, I think the attempt is here to actually see, it's not just about the margins, the psychotic and whatever we are talking about, but how it reveals how state functions. Because what is happening in margin becomes indicative of how is state functioning, because largely we look at these spaces as the spaces where state is failing, but it's much more than that is happening. State is always anxious. State needs margins. State has to constantly create exceptions, disorder, chaos, so that it finds its ways to create these ordering mechanisms, either by using law or by using the biopolitical ordering force, which I think is your first question, is something on which I really need to think, and three of us will sit together. But yes, it's about the psychotic times and also the psychotic state largely that we are referring to over here. Well, I don't think we have read Palak Narayan work, and maybe Chetan, Ruchira, you can further add. But what is important over here is that when we look at world-classness, it's about how it works as an empty, diffuse signifier. You see, it doesn't exist out there. And yet it is imagination is created, and that imagination is enough to create certain ordering mechanisms where at times law can be used, and at times just the force of law is also enough. Yes, different spaces will come out with different stories. So what will be its version as a parochial narrative? What will be its version in, say, in a metropolitan? All that is going to vary, in which ethnographies become important. But as a concept, it becomes important because here state is trying to sell off a dream to all of us. And how that, and it's a completely Lacanian imaginary realm of even a point of psychosis where it doesn't have really any symbolic anchoring over there. So we are interested in seeing how is that working. And over there we draw from literature which spans which cuts across borders. So we really do not Eurocentrism is one way of looking at it, but knowledges also do not have borders in everything. So it's an attempt to understand the contemporary times. But yeah, we will look up this work. Maybe you guys can further add too. Education is a state project, what you were asking. And it's very interesting to see over here, which I would say educators have little bit missed. And here we find the work of urban scholars from Srivastava, Rautri, Bhan, Baviskar, and so many more who have done brilliant work in looking at the precarity of urban order and how that is maintained. We forget that precarity is not possible without education. And by education, I'm not just talking of school. I'm talking of the technology of education, by which I'm drawing from technology of sexuality of Foucault, the way he uses it, which is not just about sex. So education is not just about schooling, but the way we are always schooled as a body, as a citizen, as in a very normal way. And for that, it just goes in the matrix of state, margin, and city. The way city has to invisibilize and blur the margins and yet need to have the margins. Something very exciting is happening in the spectrum of education, which educators have sort of missed or not really connected with the larger phenomena which are happening in our times. Yeah.
Thank you for the questions. Coming to your question first, so when the question that you put forth, the way you're looking at urban education. So in the context of my study, I would say that, on one hand, yes, there's this constant identity aspiration struggle that I see in in the community that I am studying. And, it's not just about that, people don't want to educate their children or send their children to private schools because they do not have that, they do not have that financial status or economic condition. It is at times also a conscious effort on their part. Like, for example, in my study, the first generations are very, very against this kind of an education which does not, which alienates them from their culture. And on the other hand, you find the second generation who are extremely, who are all for this world-class education, all for this private, English medium schools, because they aspire to be part of these ever-changing, transformatory city, city spaces. So urban education, I have tried to locate urban education in the context of identity aspiration struggle. So, and in fact, that is leading to an internal polarization, internal fragmentation as well, because there are, you can see conflicting, contradictory discourses between the first and the second generation with regard to formal education. Gautam, thank you for your question. Regarding the brute force, I just wanted to, of course, this is something which this is work in progress, so I'm just, exploring these ideas. So of course, brute force is definitely there, but what I was, when I used aesthetic governmentality, the idea was to show that something that I also mentioned at the beginning, that, it's not that this is aesthetics is or aesthetic governmentality is the consequence of this time. What I wanted to show is the kind of randomness, the kind of arbitrariness, there are no rules, there are no procedures, which at one point of time was there when, modern power was rising, when there was scientific rationality, there was certain work that was involved. There were surveys to actually, demarcate, whom to be controlled and whom to be, given the facilities. So that is no longer there in aesthetic governmentality. There's a randomness, there's an arbitrariness, there are no rules. You see a polluting space and then, you're all for evicting that space in the name of beautification. So I was trying to, capture, I was trying to understand that randomness, that arbitrariness, in aesthetic governmentality. Regarding your first question, I need an elaborate discussion with you. Regarding your camp, because I was not very, I was not very sure about what you were trying to say, so I need to, think about the question again. Regarding your camp, you're completely right that, of course, the context was Holocaust. But, I used this particular framework to actually understand how camps were formed. So, this is a community which has been staying for the past 40 years. So, of course, there's a long history. There's a trajectory to, from the time they actually formed these ghettos and the current times. So when they were forming these ghettos, of course, I was trying to understand the kind of brutality, the kind of violence, the kind of discrimination, exclusion they have gone through. Of course, there was a lot of data which I couldn't talk about. So, in order to give that kind of a, I wanted to give a conceptual framework to that kind of a violence. But you are right. Now this particular ghetto is very paradoxical because it is emancipatory as well as, on one hand, it is emancipatory for the first generations, like they want to be there despite the fact that they have attained a certain class status, but they don't want to move to the mainland city. They would prefer to be in that ghetto. And on the other hand, you see this second generation who are extremely aspirational and they want to be part of this world-class city-making project. They want, and that's how they want to legitimize their belongingness to the city. So yes, I agree with you that camp will not be the only way. A government's camp will not be the only way to understand this. But, I just wanted to show, I wanted to just give a framework to the kind of violence and brutality that led to the formation of these ghettos. Yeah.
I think I'll just very quickly take up the aesthetic question with lack of time. But Gautam, thank you so much. You're absolutely right that maybe aesthetics itself is becoming a little meaningless in our times. And one of the things that I was sort of arguing last time when we were discussing this was that, if you look at Kantian question of aesthetic judgment, it was always a question which he said that rational judgment is something which you bring to the object, categories bring to the object, and aesthetics, rational is what the object brings to you, and aesthetics is what you bring as a subject to the object, isn't it? So aesthetic movement towards aesthetic terms of power in that sense was always a question of movement away from the restrictions that object creates for you. Object creates certain constrictions of movement. And when you can freely bring something to the object, you're always free. So that freedom always emerged at a cost of you getting closed down as a subject. It is there I started moving to psychoanalysis, where I realized that subject's own truth is centered to this. Because aesthetics is just a question of legitimization of a truth. So what becomes important here is not aesthetics as much. You're right. You can even let go of the aesthetics now. What is important is how is the subject's truth being created? And in that sense, how is power's truth being created? And how power is legitimizing its truth? Because that is where politics is being played out today. That is where the whole question of trust is sort of existing. And till the point we don't ask that question with some honesty, that why is it that certain truths are so easily accepted by large populations? And it's not simply is it for their own self-interest. That's not a theory I would sort of agree with, because that is where I think unconscious plays an important role there. It's something bigger than that. It's something more than that which has to be thought through. And I think language and symbolic domain of ours plays some important role, which I think Gertner's own work doesn't really touches the symbolic and then moves out of it. I think symbolic is the domain that we need to think more about, like Veena Das's work or Wittgenstein's thinking, whatever. There's something we need to struggle with more. I think. Thank you so much. I think we don't have time. We just don't have. We just don't have.